He thanked the caterers, the florists, the janitor who emptied the trash bins at the community center. Then he moved on to his business partners, his wife's yoga coach, even the sound technician who tested the microphone that morning. He raised a glass and said, "We couldn't have done this without you." But not a single word about me. Not a glance, not a pause. I was sitting right there in the same room I helped build with my late husband's savings. The name on the building used to be mine. Now, not even a seat at the table came with it. I sat in the last row near the back exit where the heaters barely reached. My coat stayed buttoned, and I kept my gloves on, pretending I liked the view of the courtyard. Most of the guests faced the stage, their faces warm under string lights and well-rehearsed speeches. I watched Elliot, my only son, stand tall at the podium, glowing in his charcoal blazer like he belonged to some magazine cover. He always did know how to look presentable. The event was his Christmas celebration. Technically, it was a holiday thank you party for contributors to the Gelman Heritage Center, the very building we stood in. I remembered when this place was just sketches and hopeful talk over Harold's hospital bed. He wanted a community hub, something educational, long-lasting. Elliot took the idea, ran with it, and now I was just a footnote of that. He spoke well. He always did. Years of presenting at fundraisers had polished his tone to something confident but modest. He knew how to charm a room. That night, he thanked a long list of people. He turned his body slightly with each new name, hand gestures, perfectly timed. It was a dance of gratitude, smooth and rehearsed. When he mentioned the architect, I felt something tighten in my chest. When he praised the committee members, it twisted. And when he said, "This vision could never have come to life without the support of so many dedicated souls," I waited. A pause, perhaps a smile toward me. Nothing. I stared at the empty place card in front of me. Mine didn't have a name. It just said Guest of Honor. The kind of title that lets people skip actually calling you anything. There was no family photo slideshow, no framed picture of Harold near the tree, no quiet word from Elliot even after the applause died down. That's when I knew this wasn't my story anymore. I was no longer the beginning of anything here, only a placeholder, a quiet seat in the back. But I didn't leave. Not yet. Not before understanding how far this erasure had gone. If you've ever sat through a celebration where your name was missing, where your love and labor was swallowed up by someone else's spotlight, then maybe you know what that night felt like. Cold didn't come from the air. It came from being invisible. The gifts were handed out after dessert. The servers came around with trays of brandy-soaked bread pudding and fresh coffee, and Elliot clapped his hands to quiet the room. His voice lifted easily over the low hum of conversation. He said he had a little surprise, just a token of appreciation for those who made this year unforgettable. One by one, the boxes came out, each wrapped in silver foil tied with thick velvet ribbon. The woman beside me unwrapped a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed in gold. The couple across the table got a handmade ornament set crafted by a local artist. Someone let out a small laugh when they pulled out a monogrammed cashmere scarf. Each gift was curated personal. You could tell a team had spent time thinking through every detail. When the box came to me, it was smaller than the rest lighter, too. I untied the ribbon and opened the lid to find a tin of chamomile tea, mass-market brand. The kind you grab off the end cap at the grocery store when you forgot someone on your list. No note, no name, just a label that read Soothing Blend. I held it in my hands for a moment, waiting. Maybe there had been a mistake. Maybe another box was coming. But then Elliot caught my eye and smiled. Not a warm, grateful smile, more like a passing glance. He turned his attention back to the room and raised a toast. To community, to growth, to legacy. People clinked their glasses. I sipped water. The metal tin felt cold in my lap. Brianna, his wife, leaned toward me and whispered something about how thoughtful Elliot had been. She said with a tone like a closing door that they knew I liked simple things. Her smile was tight. She wore a diamond necklace I had seen in a catalog Harold once circled for me years ago. He never bought it, but here it was glittering under the lights. A photographer passed by asking for a group picture. People gathered near the tree. I stood up halfway, thinking I would be called, but the group had already filled in arms around each other, cheeks pressed close. I sat back down. The photographer snapped the shot. Behind them, the plaque on the wall still bore my last name, but no one was looking at it. I placed the tea back in the box, folded the ribbon carefully, and closed the lid. I didn't say anything. Not to Brianna, not to Elliot, not to the woman next to me who had started showing off her journal. Some things don't need to be said out loud. Something just settle inside you, quiet and sharp, like metal on your lap, like steam from someone else's cup, like watching your place get smaller with every passing gesture. When the group started moving toward the front lobby for the next round of speeches, I slipped away through a side door. I didn't need to hear more names or witness more polished gratitude. I knew the layout of this place better than most. After all, I had helped shape it when it was just blueprints and budget discussions over late dinners with Harold. I made my way down the hallway past the glass display of historical photos and donor plaques. The lights dimmed slightly the further I walked, like the past fading behind the brightness of whatever came next. At the end of the corridor was a door marked Archive. The key card still worked. I had kept the access pass all these years, though no one ever asked for it back. Inside, it was quiet, just the hum of a small heater and the smell of old paper and wood polish. This used to be the planning room. Harold and I had spent hours in here mapping out how the center could serve the community, not as a brand, not as a platform, but as a living space where people felt seen. I stepped to the far wall where the original floor plan had once hung. It was gone. In its place was a large, glossy poster showing the upcoming renovations. The new design was slick, full of buzzwords: flexible event space, multi-use gallery, youth innovation pod. Not a single mention of the reading corner for seniors, no trace of the local history listening room. Both ideas had been mine. My eyes scanned the renderings. The walls had been moved. The room names changed. The spaces we had fought to preserve were gone, erased, like they were never part of the vision. At the bottom corner in small print, it read, Gelman Heritage Center, sponsored by the Elliott Gelman Foundation. I felt a rush of something that was not quite anger but had the same weight. I leaned closer, looking at the stylized floor plan, and spotted a small square marked Reserve Storage. That used to be the room where Harold and I held private reading sessions for veterans and teachers. Now it was just a storage unit. A file box sat on a side table near the window. Inside were copies of brochures and recent board meeting notes. I picked one up and skimmed through the minutes. Words like asset leverage and brand alignment jumped off the page. In the closing remarks, Elliot had suggested removing outdated legacy language to reflect the current direction. I closed the folder slowly and sat down in the corner armchair, the one Harold used to nap in after long meetings. The fabric was worn smooth on the arms. I ran my hand along the edge and let the silence stretch. There was no confrontation, no outrage, just that slow, familiar ache of watching something you built become something else entirely, of watching your fingerprints be wiped clean, of realizing your name had become an inconvenience in the story now being told. I stayed in that room for a while. I don't know how long. Long enough to hear the last round of applause echo down the hallway. Long enough to feel the weight of erasure settle into my bones. The invitation came through a text message the next morning. Just a short line from Elliot asking if I was free for brunch. He said there was something he wanted to run by me. I stared at the message longer than necessary before replying. I said yes. We met at a place downtown. Newer spot, neutral colors, smooth jazz, and locally sourced menus. The kind of restaurant where people wore scarves indoors and the servers recited ingredients like poetry. Elliot had already ordered coffee when I arrived. He stood to greet me, kissed my cheek, then gestured for me to sit always polite, always polished. He started with small talk, asked if I got home okay, said the turnout at the party had exceeded his expectations. Then he thanked me for coming, said it meant a lot to have me there. I nodded. I didn't say much. I let him talk. Then he shifted. Said he'd been thinking a lot about the next phase for the center. That momentum was building and investors were interested. But in order to grow, certain things had to be streamlined. Legal structures, public messaging, ownership. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a folder on the table. Said it was just a draft. Nothing final, just something to think about. The top page had my name on it. Legal language I didn't care for. Transfer of administrative rights, revision of founding titles, a quiet erasure disguised as optimization. He said this would help attract more grants, that boards were more comfortable working with one centralized name. He reminded me that I was retired, that I had already given so much, and that of course I'd still be listed somewhere honorary, founding inspiration, something tasteful. I looked at the folder, then back at him. He wasn't pushing. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. His tone was calm, his face open, but the pressure was there, woven into the smoothness. The kind of pressure you can't argue with because it doesn't give you anything to push back against. I didn't open the folder. I folded my napkin slowly, set it beside my plate, and said I would take a look at it later. He smiled and said, "Take my time." The check came before I finished my tea. He paid, of course, said he was proud of what we were building. We. The word hung in the air between us. I walked back to my car with the folder pressed against my side. It wasn't heavy, but it weighed down my steps. When I reached the driver's seat, I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes on the quiet street ahead. He had asked nothing, not directly, but he had made everything clear. By the time I pulled away, the brunch was already slipping into the background. What stayed with me was that folder still unopened, still humming with quiet instructions, still waiting for my name to disappear. That night I couldn't sleep. The folder stayed on my kitchen table unopened under the soft pool of light from the old lamp Harold used to read under. I had made a cup of tea and let it go cold. Every time I reached for the folder, something in my chest pulled back. Not fear exactly, not confusion either. Just a heaviness, like opening it would make something final. Around midnight, I went to the back room, the one Harold had called the quiet room. It used to be his space for letters, old photographs, and papers he never wanted filed away. Most of it had been boxed up after he passed, but I kept one cabinet untouched. Not out of sentiment, more out of habit. I opened the bottom drawer and found the yellow envelope almost immediately. It had my name written in Harold's handwriting. Neat, tilted slightly right, like always. The seal was still intact. I had never opened it. I didn't even remember why. I took it to the table, pushed the folder aside, and slid the letter out. There were 2 pages, one typed, one handwritten. The typed page was a certified copy of the property title. The community center was listed under my name alone, not jointly, not through a trust, not with Elliot, just me, and attached was a statement from Harold's estate declaring that upon his death, his financial contribution to the center would remain protected under my discretion. The handwritten page was short, just a few sentences. If the time ever comes when you feel like you're being erased, this is your anchor. You are not an accessory to someone else's story. You built this and you decide what happens next. I read it twice, then again. The light above the table flickered slightly. I looked back at the folder, still unopened, still resting beside the empty teacup. Elliot hadn't asked directly for the rights, but he hadn't needed to. The shape of the conversation had made it clear. He wanted control. He had used politeness like a soft blade, and now he was closing in. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into my cardigan pocket. The folder stayed where it was. Instead, I opened the cabinet again and pulled out a small box labeled Archive Room Keys. Inside were a few keys, a thumb drive, and a copy of the Cent's original mission statement. My handwriting was still on the margins. Notes about accessibility, warmth, human dignity. I sat back in the chair and let the room settle around me. The quiet felt different now. Not empty, not defeated, just full of something that had been waiting to wake up. Harold had known long before I did. He had given me something I hadn't realized I needed. Not money, not ownership, but permission to stand my ground, to protect the space I helped build. And more than that, to protect my name, my story, my presence. I turned off the light, went to bed, and left the folder where it was still sealed, still trying to rewrite something I was no longer willing to let go. The next morning, I called Esther Bensalis. He had been Harold's attorney for almost 2 decades, a quiet man always dressed too formally even when he came over for coffee. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the estate settled, but he picked up on the second ring. I told him I had a few questions about a document Harold had left behind. He told me to come by after lunch. His office sat on the second floor of a sandstone building downtown, just above a tailor shop that had been there since I was in my 30s. The staircase creaked exactly the way it used to. The waiting room smelled like old books and furniture wax, the same warm scent I remembered from every visit with Harold. The framed degrees on the wall had faded slightly, and the lamp on the side table still leaned too far to the left. Esteban greeted me with the same gentle tone he always had. No rush, no small talk, just a nod and a chair pulled out for me. He waited for me to explain. I handed him the envelope and said nothing else. He took his time reading through the pages. Then he folded his hands and looked at me the way a person does when they know something matters more than it appears. Harold was thorough, he said, and careful. He didn't leave that paper in your hands by mistake. He knew someday you might need a way to protect what both of you built. I told him about the brunch, about the folder, about how I had sat through my own erasure like a guest in someone else's story. Esban didn't react much, but his voice got quieter. He asked if I wanted to contest anything formally. I shook my head. This wasn't about dragging Elliot through courts or headlines. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. I told him I wanted to create something new with the property, something independent, something that couldn't be absorbed or renamed or stripped down to PR language. I didn't know what to call it yet. I just knew it had to start now. He nodded, said it could be done, that the documents Harold left gave me full control. More than that, they proved intention, not just ownership, but purpose, and that made all the difference. We spent the next hour going over steps, establishing a new nonprofit entity, registering it under my own name, creating bylaws that locked out any future override by outside interests. He would prepare the paperwork. I would come back in 3 days to sign. When I stood up to leave, he paused and said one more thing. You don't owe anyone silence. Least of all when your silence is the only thing holding their version of the story together. I walked down the stairs slower than I came up, not because I was tired, but because everything under my feet felt steadier. That night, I cleared a drawer in my hallway for new papers labeled a fresh folder with my own handwriting, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was guarding a past. I was preparing for something that hadn't existed yet, but would because I said so. I started with Ellen. She was 2 years older than me, a retired nurse who lived down the street. We hadn't spoken in months, not since the neighborhood book exchange closed. I called her and said I wanted to talk about something. Not urgent, just important. She came by with a tin of butter cookies and her cane tucked under one arm. We sat at my kitchen table, sunlight falling through the window in soft angles. I asked her to tell me the first time she felt invisible. She blinked, then laughed, like it was a strange question, but her voice shifted when she started talking. She spoke about hospital nights, how she worked 30 years, then got invited to her own retirement party as an afterthought. She talked about being told she was too slow, too old-fashioned, too soft. She remembered patients who held her hand and whispered things no one else ever heard. By the time she finished, we had gone through 2 cups of coffee and a dozen years of buried memory. I wrote down everything not to publish, not to frame, just to keep. Something told me that stories left untold began to fade from the people who carried them. I didn't want that for Ellen. The next day, I called Margaret, then Deborah, then Irene. One by one, women I had known through volunteer circles, library groups, bridge clubs. Women who had held entire families together, held jobs through grief and war, then quietly slipped into corners no one looked at anymore. They came with folders and boxes and voice recorders. Some came with nothing but the willingness to sit and speak. We sat in the den or in the backyard under the small string lights Harold had hung years ago. No scripts, no plans, just a question I didn't have to ask more than once. They remembered when their husbands died, when their names disappeared from church bulletins, when their opinions stopped being asked at dinner tables, when children who once clung to their legs now barely remembered birthdays. I didn't interrupt. I listened. I wrote. And when they cried, I didn't fill the space. I let the silence do its work. I created folders for each of them labeled by hand, their names on the outside, their words on the inside. Each story sat on my shelf like a spine returned to alignment. By the end of that week, the cabinet that once held Harold's documents now held 24 narratives, some only a page, some almost a book. I didn't call it anything yet, but in my head, I had started saying the phrase, the memory vault. Not because the past needed to be preserved, but because the women who built it did. I knew Elliot wouldn't understand. He would call it small, sentimental, off-mission. But that didn't matter. This wasn't about mission statements or public image. This was about reminding people like Ellen, like me, that the things we lived through were still real, still ours, still worth keeping. A week after my visit to Esbon's office, an envelope arrived by courier. Cream-colored paper, embossed seal. My name handwritten across the front in blue ink. I already knew what was inside. I didn't need to open it to feel the pressure it carried. I brought it into the kitchen, placed it next to the teapot, and let it sit there while I finished folding a load of laundry. There was something deliberate about waiting. I had learned over the course of many quiet years that silence often says more than reply. Eventually, I opened the envelope. Inside was a second draft of the agreement Elliot had offered me over brunch, slightly revised language, more polished formatting. This time, it included a letterhead from a law firm I didn't recognize and a brief note from Elliot. He said the board was eager to move forward, that this version had clarified a few things for my peace of mind. He ended with a sentence about legacy, how proud Harold would have been to see everything coming together. I folded the papers and placed them back inside the envelope without signing a thing. Instead, I went to the living room, opened the small file cabinet beneath the bookshelf, and pulled out the first batch of transcribed stories. Ellen's, Margaret's, Irene. Their words typed and printed still carried the weight of each woman's voice. I reread the opening paragraph of Ellen's file and felt something subtle. Not just certainty, something closer to direction. I selected 3 of the shorter transcripts and walked down to the mailbox 2 blocks away. The local newspaper still accepted submissions for their Sunday feature series. I had clipped stories from that section for years. The theme had always been community voices, so I sent 3 of them. No name, no bio, just the words, and a note that these were parts of a larger memory project. I didn't expect a reply. Back home, I began scanning the other transcripts, storing copies on a flash drive, and labeling folders with more intention. By the end of the day, I had written a mission statement, 1 paragraph clear and quiet. It read, "The Memory Vault is a living archive, created to preserve the voices of women whose lives shaped communities, but were never documented. It exists to record what would otherwise be forgotten." I printed it and pinned it above my desk. That night, I drafted a simple email to Esbon. I told him I would like to proceed with the nonprofit registration, using that statement as our guiding purpose. I also asked him to prepare a legal response declining Elliot's proposal in full. I didn't send a message to Elliot. There was no need. He would hear soon enough through the channels he respected more than conversation. At dusk, I returned to the kitchen. The teapot was still warm. I poured a cup, took the envelope with the contract, and placed it in the drawer beneath the sink. Not torn, not burned, just put away like a version of the story that no longer applied, like something edited out for the sake of clarity. The community meeting was held on a Thursday evening just before the holidays. The center was dressed for the occasion. White lights strung around the main entrance, a wreath on every door, tables lined with programs printed in navy ink and folded neatly. Elliot stood near the podium, greeting guests as they walked in, his smile-steady suit pressed sharp at the shoulders. I arrived early but stayed in the back. I took a seat near the coat rack, far enough to observe, close enough to be ready. No one looked in my direction. Maybe they thought I was someone's aunt or a retired librarian tagging along. Either way, it gave me the quiet I needed. The meeting opened with updates about construction, upcoming events, community partnerships. Elliot spoke with the same ease I had heard all my life, every word calculated to sound sincere. When he introduced the new strategic vision, the room leaned in. A slide appeared behind him, projecting a sleek mock-up of the expansion, rebranded signage, new programming partnerships with larger institutions, all tied to what he called the next chapter. Then he began listing the names of the Leadership Council donors, designers, project leads. He paused, looked around the room, and said they were honored to build on the foundation set by those who came before. Not once did he say my name. Before the next slide could appear, I stood. Not abruptly, not in protest, just enough that people noticed. I walked toward the front and stopped beside the edge of the stage. Elliot's eyes met mine. His smile didn't falter, but I saw the shift in his shoulders. A small, almost imperceptible bracing. I didn't ask for the microphone. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Inside was the deed, the nonprofit charter, the mission statement. I handed them to the meeting coordinator, who looked confused but took them anyway. I said only one thing, clear and calm. This space is being restructured effective immediately. Its purpose and ownership fall under the charter enclosed. The name has been restored. Its mission has been clarified. There will be no further branding changes or transfers. Then I stepped aside and returned to my seat. No gasps, no murmurs, just a long moment where the room seemed to forget how to move. Elliot lowered his hands. He didn't speak. The coordinator began flipping through the papers, scanning quickly, lips moving silently across each line. A woman in the second row, someone I didn't know, leaned forward slightly. The man next to her whispered something and nodded toward me. And just like that, the room shifted, not in noise and atmosphere. The meeting didn't continue, at least not the way it was planned. Elliot stepped down from the stage. The lights dimmed as the projector turned off. People stood unsure of what to say or where to go. I left through the side door. Outside, the air was colder than it had been all week. I pulled my coat tighter and walked down the sidewalk, not quickly, not triumphant, just steady. What had needed to be said was now part of the record, not just in paper, in presence, in a turn. The article appeared 2 Sundays later. It wasn't front page, just a modest placement near the center under the section called Community Profiles. But the headline stopped me cold. The woman who remembered the subheading spoke of legacy quiet resistance and a project unfolding in the corners of a city too quick to forget. There were no photos, no interview quotes, just an overview of the memory vault and how a retired woman unnamed in the article had begun gathering oral histories of overlooked women in her neighborhood. They used the phrase, quiet reclamation. I cut the page clean and slid it between the pages of Harold's dictionary, not because I needed to keep it, but because some things deserve to be marked. That morning, my phone rang 4 times. I didn't answer the first 3. The 4th came from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The voice on the recording was young, shaky, but kind. She said her name was Becca and that she thought I knew her mother. She came by the next afternoon. Becca stood on my porch in a green jacket too thin for the weather, holding a reusable grocery bag full of papers and cassette tapes. Her eyes looked like someone I used to know. Her mother's name was Teresa. I remembered her. We had worked together on a school fundraising committee back in the 90s. She had been bright, relentless, and full of ideas. And then she disappeared, moved away, married someone in another state, never returned. Becca told me her mother had passed 3 years ago. She found the tapes while cleaning out her grandmother's house. She had no idea what they were, but one of them was labeled in her mother's handwriting for Loretta. Memory session draft. She asked if she could leave them with me. I nodded. After she left, I brought the bag inside and played the tape. The voice that came through was rough with age, but unmistakably Teresa. She told stories I had forgotten. She spoke about her father's store, her first job the time she almost quit school to take care of her siblings. And near the end, she said something I wasn't prepared for. She said, "If you're listening to this, it means you're still doing the work. I hope you remember me. I hope I mattered enough to be part of it." I paused the tape and sat very still. Outside, the sky had turned the color of brushed silver. The street was empty. The bare branches of the trees cast long shadows against the windows. I stayed there until the light began to shift again, holding the tape in one hand and my breath in the other. Later that evening, I wrote Teresa's name on a new folder. I added it to the others. One more spine. One more life returned to place. Not everyone would understand what that meant. Not everyone needed to. But someone had remembered, and someone else had known it was worth passing on. The first gathering took place in the smallest room of the center, the one that used to be the children's reading corner. Back when Harold and I dreamed it would be more than a building. The carpeting had been replaced. The shelves moved around, but the windows still faced west. Light poured in slow and gold through the blinds that afternoon. We set up chairs in a circle. No stage, no podium, no titles, just folding chairs and a low table in the middle with a pot of coffee, a stack of paper cups, and a tin of sugar cookies someone brought. There were 12 of us. Women from different parts of town, different backgrounds, most of them older than 60. Some arrived in silence. Others chatted as they found a seat. I didn't prepare a speech. I welcomed them simply and explained that this was a space for stories, not interviews, not performances, just space. One woman Ruth shared first. She spoke about the time she spent teaching at a rural school. No one remembered how she used to bring extra food in her purse because half her students came hungry. Another woman, Patrice, talked about raising 4 children while caring for her mother and how no one ever asked how she managed. A third woman, Helen, pulled a photograph from her wallet and passed it around. Her story came out in fragments. We waited through each pause. I sat and listened. I took notes when they allowed it. Most of the time, I kept my hands in my lap and my eyes steady. I didn't comment. I didn't shape the stories or interrupt. The silence between their sentences was just as important as the words themselves. We stayed for almost 2 hours. No one looked at the clock. No one took photos. No one asked what would happen with the recordings or where this would be published. That wasn't the point. Before they left, a few women lingered. Some helped clean up. One woman, Darlene, who had barely spoken during the circle, touched my shoulder lightly as she walked past. Her hand was soft. She said nothing, but her eyes held something whole, something grateful. When the room emptied, I remained for a few minutes longer. I didn't feel the need to rush. I looked at the chairs still arranged in that quiet circle, and I realized that was all I had ever wanted. A place where nothing needed to be defended, a place where people could speak without having to prove they mattered. The sun had dipped lower by then. The gold light on the floor had turned orange. I turned off the lights, shut the door behind me, and walked the length of the hallway without a sound. The center felt different now, not just because of ownership, but because it had remembered its purpose. I never changed the name of the center again. I didn't add mine back to the building or carve it into a new plaque. I didn't commission a mural or build a wing in my memory. That wasn't what I came back for. The story didn't need to be rewritten. It just needed to stop being erased. I kept coming every Thursday, sometimes to organize papers, sometimes to unlock the door for someone who wanted to leave behind their voice. Other days, I came just to sit in the second room on the right, where the light always fell quiet on the floor. I kept the lights low and the chairs in a circle. The archive grew slowly, a folder at a time. Most of the women came and went without fanfare. Some returned with baked goods or old newspaper clippings or cassette tapes from decades past. They never asked what I was building. I think they knew it was more than an archive. It was a way back into their own names. One afternoon in early spring, I sat alone by the window with a pen in hand, a blank page before me. I wasn't writing a statement or a record. I just wrote what I needed to remember. You don't need permission to be seen. That sentence sat there for a long time. Then I closed the notebook and tucked it between 2 volumes of stories. I didn't label it. I didn't need to. Outside, the trees were beginning to green again. Not fully, but enough to make you believe in something starting. I locked the front door behind me and walked slowly to my car. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No big speech, no viral article, just a steady continuation of something quiet, something true. And that, I think, was enough. If you've ever felt like your story was too small to matter or that your voice was overlooked in rooms you helped build, maybe this reminded you of something true. I'd love to know what part of Loretta's journey stayed with you the most. You can share your thoughts in the comments or simply take a quiet moment for yourself, because sometimes being heard starts with knowing you are never truly silent. Hoy Chat GPT.